Sentient Creatures, a lecture series in the connected program of Log Society about consciousness, robots, and communication.
At that stage, there'll be a 15-minute talk between he and I on the idea of artificial intelligence, because one of the aims of this entire lecture series is to bring people who are not professional artificial intelligence researchers into this debate to talk about what this evolving form of consciousness may or could or will be. And after that, there will be a 15-minute time period where we can all ask Mr. Sheldrake questions. Again, please wait for the microphone. And I will be quite strict in having people wait until the end to ask her questions. And then after the talk is over, I plan a small informal experiment, anyone who wants to participate, in being able to see if any of us have the sense of being stared at. So I will give the floor to you, Mr. Sheldrake.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. The idea that I'm going to be talking about this evening is that our minds are not confined to the insides of our heads. They're not all in our brains. What I'm going to suggest is our minds are fields of activity rooted in our brains, but which stretch out far beyond them. We're used to the idea of fields stretching out beyond material systems from magnets. The field of a magnet extends much further than the limit of the iron bar. And the field of a cell phone extends much further than the object you hold in your hand. If it didn't, it wouldn't work. So we're very familiar with the idea of fields rooted in material systems that stretch out beyond them. What I'm going to suggest is that our minds are fields rooted in the physical system of our brain, but stretching out beyond them in every act of perception. And I think a lot of phenomena that at present seem paranormal actually seem perfectly normal as soon as we adopt the idea of the extended mind. Because this leads to a very different way of a very different idea of the way intelligence works, it has implications for artificial intelligence. And actually, these implications were seen with remarkable clarity right at the very beginning of the entire field. In his classic 1950 paper on machine intelligence, Alan Turing made a comment that's very little known in the world of artificial intelligence, which is very relevant to what I'm saying this evening. You remember that his test was whether you could, if you were conversing with a machine or a person, if you couldn't tell the person from the machine, you were in a separate room, then that would be a test of whether the machine had intelligence. It was a very famous idea. But there was one thing that Turing thought the computer couldn't do. That was telepathy. Turing was convinced that, in his own words, the statistical evidence for telepathy is overwhelming. Turing was convinced that it existed, and he thought that the way to run a test, to test between a person and a machine, would be to do a telepathy test. Here's the account of it. Given that you had a human being gifted with ESP in one room and a computer in another, the player in his imitation game could ask the two candidates to guess a given sequence of cards. Since the computer, using a random number generator, would be able to guess only at chance levels, it would soon become clear which of the two was the human being and which was the computer. Fascinating that he should have taken what's really an implicit idea in telepathy, that the mind is extended beyond the brain, as the thing that would distinguish between computers and human beings. Well, what I'm going to talk about now is the idea of the extended mind, the mind beyond the brain, in ordinary visual perception. I'm not talking now about obscure, marginal phenomena. I'm talking about mainstream phenomena happening all the time, like you seeing me standing here. The normal way of understanding visual perception is known to everyone in this room. It's, of course, that light reflected from me goes through the electromagnetic field, enters your eye, through the lens, inverted images on your retinas, changes in the cone cells, electrical impulses up the optic nerve, changes in the brain, electrical and chemical changes in various regions of the brain. So far, so good. This has been studied in great detail. But then comes something very mysterious. You form a conscious image of me. There's nothing in any of the standard computing way that people think about vision to explain why you should have a conscious image at all. It should just be a matter of wires processing information. But in fact, you do have a conscious image of me. And the second mystery, rarely discussed, but very problematic when you think about it, is that your conscious image of me is supposed to be a kind of virtual reality show going on inside your head. It's all supposed to be inside your head, because the conventional assumption is that the mind is the brain. It's all in the head. Now, I imagine that none of you are experiencing your image of me as being located inside your head. I'm guessing that you're experiencing it as being located right here where I'm standing. And the theory I want to put forward is so simple that it's really hard to understand. And that is that your image of me is located right here. It's an image in your mind. It's interpreted by your mind, but it's not inside your head. It's outside your head where it seems to be. So I'm suggesting vision involves a two-way process, an inward movement of light and an outward projection of the entire visual world. Everything you see is projected out. In a sense, your mind is reaching out to touch what you're looking at. The virtual reality show isn't in your head. It's projected out and coinciding with the actual world. Sometimes it doesn't. Then you have an illusion or a hallucination. But usually it does. And if it didn't, we'd bump into things all the time and wouldn't survive very long. When you think about the conventional view that it's all inside the head, it leads to a very absurd paradox, which very few people actually think through. If the whole room that you're experiencing, all this perceptual world is inside your head, then if you look outside when you're outdoors and you look up at the stars, then they're inside your head too. So your skull must be beyond the sky. This is the subject of a recent paper in Brain and Behavioral Science, where someone's pointed out this is the implication of the normal view. The skull is beyond the sky. I'm saying the skull's right where it seems to be, and the perceptual world's out there. This is not a new theory. It's the theory advocated by Plato, is believed by most of the ancient Greeks and Romans, most of the medieval philosophers. It's believed by traditional people all over the world, taught by Hindu and Tibetan sages. The only people who don't believe it are people with a scientific education in the West for the last 350 years. And as a matter of fact, even young children believe that vision's a two-way process. Jean Piaget, in his studies on children's intellectual development, showed that until the age of 10 or 11, the average child believed that vision involved projection out as well as a movement of light in. However, he said by the age of 10 or 11, the average child learns the correct view, which is that thoughts and images are invisible things located inside the head. Now, most of us assimilated that idea when we were far too young to think about it, or certainly to challenge it. And so it becomes an implicit assumption of our whole culture, even though no one's ever seen an image inside anyone's head. There's virtually no evidence for it whatsoever, and yet it's almost universally believed. It's a very deep-seated habit of thought. Even in the modern world, a number of philosophers have challenged the view and put forward a view similar to the one I'm advancing, including Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, the British philosopher, and several philosophers working today. There's a British one called Max Velmans, who is advancing this view in a very sophisticated and convincing way. But I'm not talking about philosophy here. I'm talking about a scientific hypothesis. If our minds reach out to touch what we're looking at, then it means that we may even be able to affect things by looking at them. And this leads to quite a number of predictions. Imagine that you're looking at another person from behind. They don't know you're there. They can't see you, hear you, smell you, touch you. And you just stare at their back. Could they detect your gaze? Well, the answer is, this is a common experience. Most people have had the experience of turning around to find someone staring at them, or staring at someone and making them turn around. Surveys show that over 90% of the population have had these experiences. So I'm guessing that most people in this room would know what I'm talking about from personal experience. There is a slight sex difference. More women than men have experienced being looked at. More men than women have experienced looking at others and making them turn around. Nevertheless, the vast majority of both are familiar with this experience. So what's really going on? Well, it turns out it's very easy to test this. An extraordinarily simple experiment can be done to test this phenomenon. In its simplest form, this experiment involves people working in pairs. One of them wears a blindfold. I use these airline blindfolds because they're free, at least if you travel on airlines. And so the subject sits there wearing the blindfold. The person who does the staring sits behind them, at several meters behind them. And then in a random series of trials, they either stare at the back of the person's neck or look away and think of something else. So you're the subject, you're sitting here, you hear a click or a beep that tells you the trial's begun. Click. And then I have to guess if I'm being stared at or not. Well, right now, I just then guessed I was being stared at, and I was right. But it's a very simple test. You're right or you're wrong. By chance, you'd be right 50% of the time. In fact, people are right very consistently more than 50%. This gives extraordinarily repeatable results. This experiment is so simple, a child can do it. And in fact, thousands of children already have done it. It's been done widely in schools in Britain, Germany, and the United States. And thousands of adults have done it too. The pattern of results is extremely clear and predictable. By the way, you may be surprised to see me using overheads here in a center such as this. The reason I do it is I had so many problems with PowerPoint, because I use a Mac, that the last seminar I gave was at the Microsoft Research Center in Seattle. And I said to them, will your PowerPoint system work? And they said, sure. And I said, well, let's try it. And they said, no need to try it. So I put my disk in, and of course it didn't work, because it's a Mac system. And I said, have you got a Mac? They said, no. So a guy had to go for half an hour around the campus till they found a Mac. They emailed the program over. And then he said, no, it's fine. And I said, well, I just want to check it. So I checked, and there were no pictures on the things. It needed another program they hadn't got. He said, well, we can download it from the internet. And I said, the seminar begins in 2 minutes. So there was only one answer. They had to trundle on the overhead projector. And I said, well, I always carry these. I've had so much trouble with PowerPoint. So anyway, here I'm using the overheads. This shows the results of trials which involved about 700 people. This is a sample of the kind of data we get. In the looking trials, typically we get about 60-40, 60% right, 40% wrong. In the not looking trials, virtually equal, the chance level, and the average is about 55-45%. This is a very typical pattern of results that occurs over and over and over again. When I first got these data, one of my skeptical colleagues, Professor Nicholas Humphrey, said that he was sure there was a statistical artifact here, and he suggested a better way of analyzing them, where each person who takes part is given an equal weighting. If people are more right than wrong, they're scored plus. If they're more wrong than right, they're scored minus. And if they're equal, then of course it's equal. And he said go away when I used what he said was a fairer method. Well, I did his method, and this is the same result according to the Humphrey system, which show huge effect. The statistical significance of this effect is about 10 to the minus 25. I mean, it's astronomically significant. This one's 10 to the minus 15. Why do we get this effect? My interpretation is that in the looking trials, if people have a sense of being stared at, it would work when they're being stared at in the looking trials, which is where we see it. In the not looking trials, people are being asked to do something completely artificial, namely guess when they're not being looked at. Now, most of us don't have a sense of not being looked at. People who are exceptionally vain may have it, but most people don't know when they're not being looked at. So at that stage, they're just guessing, and we get a chance effect. Same here. You see, it's not significantly different from chance, and this is 10 to the minus 25. This is a massive effect. Well, of course, this work has been challenged by skeptics, and one group of skeptics in England tried reproducing my experiment following my own methods, and Here we see the results. A is the results of my experiments. B is the results of the skeptics' experiments. And as you see, it's exactly the same. They did this through one-way mirrors with tremendous insulation for sound. It was more rigorous than the way I usually do mine. I've done mine through mirrors and through all sorts of things that eliminate sounds and smells and all the rest of it. Theirs was one of the most rigorous so far, exactly the same pattern. They tried to explain it away as some kind of artifact of the randomization system. But in fact, you get the same pattern whatever randomization system you use. We now have an online version of this experiment where you can log on to my website and do the experiment there and then. It gives you all the instructions, you key in the results, and so on. And so this experiment is readily accessible. You can also download the instructions. And if any of you are teachers, you can do the experiment with a class of children as long as they're over about 8 or 9 years old. You get everything you need. You can download the randomized sheets to give to the children and so on. And the whole experiment can be done in a normal class within half an hour, and it costs nothing. This has now been done quite widely in schools in England, and teachers find that it interests children in science. People who had no interest in science before get interested, because here's a real experiment dealing with a real question. There's no standard answer in the textbooks. And there's always in every school people who are skeptical, those who believe in it. And here's a way where science can actually look at an unknown phenomenon. The largest test of this phenomenon in the world has been done right here in Amsterdam at the New Metropolis Centre, where some of you may have seen it. There's a most ingeniously designed computerized version of this experiment, where the instructions are given by the computer with a built-in randomizer. The results, it's one of the largest experiments ever conducted in the history of science. Last year, the total number of participants was 18,500. The statistical significance of the very positive results from Amsterdam has been calculated by a statistician here in Amsterdam as 10 to the minus 360. Well, this is sort of like more than the number of atoms in the universe. This is totally mind-blowingly significant. The experiment is still going on, and fortunately, 2 people from the New Metropolis Centre are here this evening who have been running and who initiated this experiment. And it is one of the, as I say, one of the largest experiments ever conducted right here in this city. In other words, in short, there's a massive amount of evidence for the reality of this phenomenon. There's no evidence against it. It fits with many people's ordinary experience. It's a phenomenon very well known to security guards, surveillance officers, private detectives. I've interviewed large numbers of people whose job it is to watch others, and most of them are very familiar with this. If you go on a training course to be a private detective, for example, perhaps most of you haven't, but if you do, very early on you learn that if you're following somebody, of course, you don't want them to see you. You don't stare at them, because if you stare at their back, they're going to turn around, see you, and your cover's blown. Of course, you have to look at them a little bit, otherwise you lose them. So these things are very well known in the military and the martial arts. You can train your sensitivity to people's intention and where they're looking at you from. These are extremely well known, especially among those who are professionals or who are trained in these areas. There are also things that happen with animals. Many people have found they can tell when animals are looking at them or when they're looking at animals. Many people find they can wake their dogs or cats by staring at them, for example. And I think these things are probably very common in the animal kingdom. I'm suggesting that animals also project out their perceptual world just like we do. There's nothing specifically human about this. It's the way vision works, I suggest. And I think that in the animal kingdom, this may go back a very long way indeed, possibly even to the first stages of the evolution of the eye, which was about 530 million years ago. In predator-prey relationships, if any prey animal could detect when a predator was looking at it and get out of the way, it would obviously increase its chance of survival. And I think that's really what lies behind a phenomenon that's normally treated as if it's completely at the margins of human experience, and yet everybody knows about. Until 10 years ago, there'd only been 3 published papers on this subject in the entire psychological literature for a century. It's been a totally taboo subject, precisely because it raises such enormous implications about about the way our minds work and the way vision works. It also, of course, has a large amount of folklore associated with it in countries like Greece, Turkey, the Arab world, India, and indeed most parts of the world, in beliefs in the evil eye. I don't know what you call it in Dutch, but I mean, most languages have a word for this. And it's believed that the evil eye, looking at somebody with anger or especially with envy, can have a negative effect on what's looked at. That makes sense against an evolutionary background of predator-prey relationships. I'm not saying the evil eye really does harm. I don't know. No one's ever done experiments on it. But I think there's a huge background, evolutionary background, that underlies this folklore. I think it's because of the folklore that it's been so strongly taboo, as well as the fact it goes against the standard theory of the mind being in the brain. Oddly enough, it also works through closed-circuit television. It's well known to security guards in department stores, shopping malls, police forces, who survey people through CCTV systems, that if you look at someone really intensely, they can sometimes pick it up and start looking around to see where the hidden cameras are. I've interviewed quite a lot of people in the security industry, which is particularly well developed in Britain. We have more closed-circuit television spy cameras than anywhere else in the world. This seems to be a fact of life. This has also been tested in laboratory experiments using closed-circuit television. The experiments have been done in a number of countries, including Britain and the United States. In those experiments, people don't guess if they're being looked at. They have their skin resistance measured with electrodes on the fingers. It's like a lie detector test. It measures emotional arousal through small degrees of sweating that occur when adrenaline is released. So people are monitored for unconscious physiological responses. They just sit there. They can read a magazine if they like. Meanwhile, in another room, another building, someone either looks at their image on a TV monitor or they look away and think of something else. People's skin resistance changes significantly when they're being looked at on a closed-circuit television system. This has been replicated several times, in fact, many times. The only non-significant results have come when skeptics have done the replication, have done the looking themselves, admitting afterwards that they were thoroughly bored and weren't looking very hard. So it's easy to understand why it didn't work under those conditions, but with everybody else, it's worked in a remarkably repeatable way. So I think the next step really would be to do it live on television. The kind of experiment Graham's planning to do this evening, later on, where you have a number of subjects and only one is looked at, that can be done on television. If you had 3 or 4 people in the studio, one of them was shown on television to millions of viewers, the others were not for 5 or 10 seconds. And then at the end of the trial, they all had to guess if they'd been looked at or not. Could they tell the difference between millions of people looking at them and no one looking at them? This could be done live on television. It could give instant statistics. If it worked, it would be absolutely astonishing, and this phenomenon would be proved beyond a shadow of doubt when it had been replicated a few times. It would also tell us something about television, normally considered a medium that just sends stuff out. But if there's an influence back on those who are in the public eye, people in the public eye might be a little bit more careful about being on television in the first place, because it may not always be a good effect that it produces. Anyway, here's a massive amount of data for a very simple phenomenon. Anyone here can check it out uniquely in Europe by going along to the local science museum and do it for yourself. Anyone can check it out on the web. Millions of people, well, not millions, but thousands of people already have. There's already a massively significant body of data. Much is published in peer-reviewed journals, and you can find texts of my papers on my website. The full texts are available there. This is also summarized in my most recent book called The Sense of Being Stared At and Other Aspects of the Extended Mind, recently published in Britain and America, not yet in Dutch. Well, these observations point to the mind having a field-like nature, that the mind is extended beyond the limits of the brain. There's a whole other lot of evidence that points to this too, and that's evidence for telepathy. I'm now going to talk about some of this evidence, but before that, I want to say something about what I think the evolutionary origins of telepathy may be. I'm arguing that telepathy is normal, not paranormal. I think it's part of our biological nature. It's extremely common. It's only called paranormal against a background of a theory of mind that says it can't happen. Then it seems paranormal. If you define the normal as what actually happens in the real world, most people have experienced it, many animals show it, it's perfectly normal and common. I'm saying it's part of our animal nature that we share with animals. Its evolutionary origins lie way back in the animal kingdom, and I think they're to do with the organization of social groups. Flocks of birds, for example, quite often can turn almost at the same time without bumping into each other. I'm thinking of starlings, for example. In the winter, we have huge flocks of starlings in Britain, thousands of birds. And when you see them flying, it's quite astonishing to see how they do this without bumping into each other. And they do it too quickly to respond just to their nearest neighbors. There are, of course, computer models of flocks of birds. The most famous from the 80s is Craig Reynolds' Boyd's model, which you can see on the internet. These are rather naive biologically. They work as computational devices for animation, like in The Lion King. But they're very naive. They don't correspond to what happens in reality. They depend on the Boyd looking at its nearest neighbors and doing computations about their average speed and direction. In fact, these things happen far too quickly in flocks of birds for birds to be able to react to their neighbors. They happen in milliseconds, too quickly for them to see things, process it in the brain, send impulses on nerves to the muscles, and so on. And these Boyd's models are, as I say, very naive biologically, although they're useful for animating Walt Disney films. The latest state-of-the-art models of flock movement in birds are indeed field models. John Toner at the University of Oregon, for example, has a field model of bird movement that's much more convincing and treats the entire flock as a field, and the individuals are responding to the field in which they're embedded. I think, in fact, that there is a field of the whole flock. It's what I call a morphic field. It's an example of this kind of biological field that I think is at work in nature. These mental fields underlying the sense of being stared at are another version of morphic field. So I think that there's a field around the whole flock and that the individuals are responding to this field. The same in schools of fish, where you can have huge schools of fish that can change direction almost instantaneously without bumping into each other. I think these are field phenomena too. And the same kind of field computer models work well for fish as well. I think packs of wolves, herds of deer, may be coordinated by morphic fields. And in fact, I think these fields enable them to keep in touch and communicate at a distance. If you think of wolves, when the adults go out hunting, the young are left in the den, usually with a babysitter, and wounded wolves hide out somewhere else. The members of the group are separated, sometimes by hundreds of kilometers. And yet, the social group is still a unit. They're all still bonded to each other. I think when they go apart, the field that links them all stretches, rather like an invisible elastic band. It doesn't break. So they continue to be connected through this field at a distance. A change in one can affect the others. And I think that's the basis for telepathy. A physical analogy comes from quantum non-locality. As many of you probably know, within physics, it's a well-established fact that parts of the same quantum system, if they've been part of the same complex system, if they move apart, a change in one is instantaneously reflected in the other at a distance. When Einstein realized this implication of quantum theory, he thought that quantum theory must be wrong because it allowed what he called a spooky action at a distance. However, experiments show that quantum theory is right, Einstein was wrong. This is now being applied in quantum computation, particularly in encryption programs. There's a lot of interest in quantum non-locality now. And recent experiments in Austria have revealed another twist on this, which is called quantum teleportation. Very weird things are allowed by quantum theory, including connections at a distance between parts of a system that have been separated. If you think of wolf packs, they're all parts of the system. They're part of a pack. They're separated. A change in one can affect the others. I'm not saying telepathy can be explained by quantum non-locality. Maybe it can, maybe it can't. We don't know enough about quantum non-locality yet, but it's certainly rather like it. Quantum non-locality is also doesn't fall off with distance, which appears to be the case with telepathy as well. So it's the best physical analogy for this process. Okay, well, I think that this is involved in animal groups separated at a distance. It's hard to work with wild animals, but it's much easier to work with the animals we know best, like dogs and cats that live in our own houses. Pets, when they're in a human family, form bonds with their human owners and often become very tightly bonded. And these would create the conditions for telepathic communication, according to the view I'm putting forward. In fact, many pet owners believe that their animals can pick up their thoughts and intentions. I've done massive surveys of pet owners and built up huge databases, more than 5,000 case histories, of seemingly inexplicable behavior by dogs, cats, parrots, horses, and other domestic animals. And over again, people have noticed forms of behavior that suggest a telepathic communication between the person and the pet. Many cat owners, for example, have noticed that their cats seem to pick up their intention to take them to the vet and disappear. We had hundreds of stories from cat owners about this phenomenon, and of course, most of them, after it's happened a few times, realize that it's no use getting out the cat-carrying basket and saying, "You're going to the vet." In fact, they usually try and not get out the basket, they try and not think about the vet, and some of them, when this happens many times, even try making the appointment from the vet when they're at work, so the cat doesn't overhear the telephone call. And then they go home to pick up the cat, and when they get there, it's still disappeared. We got so many of these stories that we did a survey to find out if this was really true. We surveyed all 65 veterinary clinics listed in the North London Yellow Pages. 64 out of 65 said they frequently had a problem with people missing appointments with the cat because it had disappeared. The one remaining one said it happened so often they'd given up an appointment system for cats. People just had to turn up with their animals. Many people have found that dogs anticipate being taken for walks. Nobody thinks it odd if the dog anticipates it at a routine time or if they see the person getting out the lead or putting on a coat or boots. What surprises people is when, say, they've been doing some rather boring work, they finish halfway through the afternoon at the computer, they think it's a nice afternoon, I'll take the dog for a walk. They feel like a change. And many people have found that in that sort of situation, within 30 seconds or so, the dog comes bounding into the room, excited and obviously anticipating the walk. We've done actual experiments on this where we've shut up dogs. We did it with a woman with 5 dogs. We shut them up in an outbuilding with a video camera there to film them continuously. Most of the time they just lay around. Then at random times, she thought of taking them for a walk for 5 minutes before actually doing so. And in those, during that 5 minutes, you can actually see on the video the dogs getting more and more excited until when she walks in the door, they're sitting in an eager semicircle around the door waiting for her to come in. They couldn't have heard her or seen anything because it's in a different building and she didn't move until just before the walk. The phenomenon that I've studied most is the phenomenon of animals knowing when their owners are coming home. Many people have noticed that their dogs or cats or other animals seem to anticipate the arrival of a member of the household. They go and wait by a door or a window. Again, if this happens at a routine time, no one thinks it's very strange, nor do they think it's strange if it's only a minute or two before, because the animal could have heard familiar footsteps in the street, the crunch of car wheels on the gravel, or other obvious clues of that kind. Some animals do it 10 minutes, even half an hour beforehand, when the owner is still miles away, even traveling by train or public transport. That begins to look much more interesting. We've done a survey of dog and cat owners and find that this is, in fact, remarkably common. We've done this survey in Britain and in the United States, and about 50% of dog owners in a random household sample say their dogs anticipate the arrival of a member of the household. Cats do it less. British cats, for some reason, do it less than American cats. We don't know why. Yes, these are all Californian. But even in California, they don't do it as much as dogs. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean cats are less sensitive than dogs. It may just mean that some of them are less interested. Anyway, a lot of cats do it too. We also have cases of rabbits, ferrets, and a range of other species that do it. All of them, however, are mammals and birds. We haven't yet got any return-anticipating goldfish or stick insects. Well, if anyone does have these, I'd like to hear about them, because fish, reptiles are something that seems very rare in, probably because they often bond less to people. Well, we've done actual experiments on this. We've built up a huge database of cases, literally about 800 cases of dogs, about 500 of cats that do this. And then we set up actual experiments. What happens in the experiments is that the owner goes at least 8 kilometers from the house. They don't know when they're coming home. They have a pager, an electronic pager, and at randomly selected times, we page them to go home. So no one knows in advance when they're going to go. So they get a signal and they go home. In many experiments, to avoid the familiar car sound argument, even though dogs couldn't possibly hear a car 8 kilometers away, we have them come home in taxis to avoid any familiar sounds. In fact, the biggest expense in this research has been the taxi bill. Meanwhile, we videotape the place where the dog waits continuously the whole time the person's away on time-coded videotape, which is later evaluated by a third person, blind, I mean metaphorically blind, because they don't know what's going on in the experiment. Obviously, they can't be really blind, otherwise they couldn't do this. They then note down the exact times to the second when the dog goes to the door. So we have a complete objective record, quantitative data about this behavior. I have a wonderful film of this, but I'm not going to show it tonight because we don't have time. I'll just show you some of the quantitative data. These show the results of some experiments we did with a dog that lives in the north of England. These are averages from a series of trials with long, medium, and short absences. These axes here refer to 10-minute periods after the owner went out. So it's the first 10 minutes, the second 10 minutes, and so on. And these are the number of seconds that the dog goes to the door or window during that 10-minute period. You see, they do go a little bit when they're just out and about. Usually they go to look at cats walking past or to bark at dogs, or if there's a noise or disturbance, they go and look out. It's clear they're not waiting when you see the video. But because we don't want skeptics to say we're using the evidence selectively, we include all the data, even though it's obviously not waiting behavior. This filled circle here is the final 10 minutes of the time, well, not the final 10 minutes, it's the first 10 minutes of the actual return journey, when the person's actually in the car going home. And as you see, the dog is at the window by far the most, highly significantly, most often, when the person's actually on the way home. But this anticipation starts even before they're in the vehicle going home. It's when the person gets the command to go home or forms the intention to go home that the dog starts waiting, before they're even in the vehicle. And this happens from at least 8 kilometers away. Well, this seems pretty clear evidence for something like telepathy. It's certainly not explainable in terms of any normal means. However, there are a lot of skeptics who don't want to accept this kind of data. So I've had to deal with every conceivable criticism. And the one that came up in England from one of our leading skeptics was that people were thinking that the electronic device, like a cell phone, flat, the parents then activated a high-pitched dog whistle that people couldn't hear that caused the dog to go and wait at the window. I asked this skeptic, I said, okay, you go and do your own experiments, check whether there's any hidden devices. And he did 3 experiments under the same conditions with the same dog. And the results of those trials, done by Richard Wiseman, one of our British skeptics, are shown in these graphs here, following the same method. And as you see, he replicated the phenomenon exactly. And these data are hugely significant statistically. The dog was at the window 78% of the time when she was on the way home, and only an average of 4% when she wasn't. significant at the p equals 0.02 level, just on 3 trials. So it's a robust phenomenon that shows up even when he was watching the dog the entire time. His assistant was with Pam, the owner of the dog, making sure there were no calls and so forth. Everything was filmed, and they used his car as well as taxis, which the dog didn't know, and that's what they found. So this phenomenon has now been replicated. It's also been replicated with other dogs. So I think the evidence for telepathy with animals is actually quite strong. Millions of people believe in it because they've experienced it. There's a kind of knee-jerk skepticism about it among many people, especially within institutional science. But this skepticism isn't based on any actual evidence or detailed studies. It's simply based on the general principle, this can't happen because the mind's in the brain, therefore nothing like this is possible. Now, since my book describing these investigations with animals was published in 1999, it's called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home and Other Unexplained Powers of Animals. I've had many more cases have come to my attention, and some of the most remarkable concern parrots. It turns out that parrots are some of the most astonishingly psychic or telepathic animals around. And when you have a parrot that can speak, that can use language meaningfully, then this becomes even more interesting because their responses can be verbal. I heard about a remarkable parrot of this kind from an artist living in New York called Aimee Morgana, who told me that her African grey had a vocabulary of hundreds of words. She'd been inspired by Irene Pepperberg at MIT, who's done a lot of work showing that African grey parrots can use language meaningfully. She's proved they can use words in an abstract way. They're better at language use than chimps or gorillas that use American Sign Language. No one thought of looking at parrots to start with because it was assumed they couldn't possibly use language and use it intelligently because they're literally bird-brained. Well, these parrots, in fact, do far better than the apes, and what's more, they do it in actual spoken language. You don't have to learn sign language. They do it in English. And Aimee's parrot, well, admittedly, it does it in English with an American accent, but her parrot now has a vocabulary of 900 words. Pepperberg's parrot, Alex, has a vocabulary of 200 after 20 years. Aimee's parrot's only 5 years old, and it has a 900-word vocabulary. It speaks in meaningful sentences. It has a theory of mind. It attributes feelings to others. It uses the word I appropriately. This is off the end of the scale of anything ever observed before. I've introduced Jane Goodall to this parrot, and she's now been there to visit on quite a number of occasions and thinks this is one of the most interesting animals in the world at the moment. So just the use of language and what it tells us about the animal mind is totally mind-blowing. But relevant to, in the context of today's discussion, what's important is that this parrot seems to pick up telepathically what its owner is thinking. She noticed this quite early on. She'd be reading a book, for example, about something, and it would comment on what she was reading about, or looking at a picture, and an advertisement of a car in a magazine sitting at the other end of the room, and it'd say, "That's a nice black car," when she was looking at a black car. I went, on my first visit to her in New York, we set up a simple test where we looked at some pictures in another room. And she was sitting there looking at a picture of a girl on a card, and from the next room, I heard the parrot say, unmistakably, "That's a girl." It seemed to pick up what she was thinking or looking at. It also picks up her dreams. It sleeps in her bedroom, and she's often woken from her dreams by the parrot commenting on them. I describe several incidents in my book, The Sense of Being Stared At. One of them is where she was dreaming about pressing a button on a tape recorder that she was tape recording the parrot with. And the parrot woke her up by saying, "Press the button," just as she was doing that in her dream. Well, this was so extraordinary that we decided to set up an experiment to test this under rigorous controlled conditions. How we did it was we made a list of key words the parrot knew that you could represent by means of pictures, photographs. For example, telephone, water, flowers, words like that. We then got a third party to find pictures from a photo source that corresponded to these words, put them in sealed brown paper envelopes, shuffle them so they're completely randomized, and then neither I nor Amy knew what was in any envelope. In the experiment, she is in a separate room on a separate floor from the parrot with all doors closed, no sound transfer possible. She opens the next envelope in the series and looks at the picture for 2 minutes, while the parrot is filmed in another room on camera continuously, time-coded videotape, and we then see what the parrot says. In some trials, it didn't say anything at all. But in many trials, it said exactly what she was looking at. We had all the tapes transcribed. We've done 150 tests. We've had all tapes transcribed by 3 independent transcribers, blind, who didn't know what was going on. All the results have been statistically analyzed completely independently. In fact, they've been analyzed right here in Amsterdam by Professor Jan van Bolhuis, who's at the Free University, a professor of statistics. And so he's done a completely independent statistical analysis. The effects are staggeringly significant statistically. What I'm going to do now is show you a video of some of these experiments. It obviously only shows a few minutes. You wouldn't want to see the hundreds of hours of videotape that we've got. This shows a selection, and of course it shows some of the more interesting episodes. It shows you some of the cases where you really don't need statistics to see that this parrot is picking up, or seems to be picking up, what she's looking at in another room. I should just say, we'll see the video in just a moment, but I should say before we do that when the experiment starts, the only voice you hear is the parrot. That's the only soundtrack you're hearing. Some people find it hard to believe it's a parrot because it sounds so like a person. We do, however, have subtitles because this was made for British audiences and it does speak with an American accent. So you'll see this experiment now with Nkisi and Aimé Morgana. For copyright reasons, we're not going to be able to stream this, so those who are watching the streaming version of this will only see a little bit of it. You'll be able to hear it. But I'm afraid we can't stream the whole thing on the internet. So could we see that? No, please.
Working for several years to train my parrots to understand and use
Sound
spoken
up.
language appropriately. Due to their ability to communicate through meaningful speech, I discovered by accident that they seemed able to read thoughts. They would often describe vocally what I was looking at, reading, or even thinking that they could not have known of any other way. I had never done anything to try to train or reward them for this. They just seemed to do it as part of their expression of our bond.
Can we have it a bit louder?
This was happening so frequently that Rupert Sheldrake and I decided to perform these controlled experiments to study it.
Okay, there's the split screen with the camera on the left going downstairs now with Aimé to film her.
Show you these pictures, okay?
Meanwhile, the camera on the right is continuing to show the parrot's cage. Okay, so she's going to open the envelopes and look at the one picture for 2 minutes. See, American phone noises.
So cool. Put your head up.
This one's obscure until you'll see a close-up in a minute that there's a guy with his head out of the car window, which is what Amy was actually looking at when he said, "Put your head out."
Oh, can I give you a hug? Can I give you a hug? Your hug?
Oh, tickle, tickle, tickle. Oh, I got you. Oh, I got you.
Now, in a minute, when you watch the parrot, you can see its beak moving as it speaks in just a few seconds.
Got you.
Can I have a kiss?
Okay. Can I have a kiss?
Hurry up.
Okay.
I can't reach you.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Well, as you see, this is just absolutely mind-boggling. And when you're in the room with the parrot, it's doing this kind of thing all the time. It's done it with me on several occasions. You know, picked up what I was thinking about in a way that was totally astonishing. Well, I don't have very long left, so I'm going to have to rush ahead and say that one of the things we found with animals was that a lot of animals seemed to know when their owners were going to call on the phone. They'd go and get excited, they'd go to the phone. Some cats would even knock the phone off the receiver and meow into it when it was their owner calling, but ignored calls from insurance salesmen and others. So this led me into an interest in telephone telepathy. There's a strange interference. This led me into an interest in telephone telepathy, which I think is by far the commonest kind in the modern world. We've done surveys that show the great majority of people have had the experience of thinking of someone for no apparent reason, then that person calls, or knowing who it is when the phone starts ringing. How many people in this room have had that kind of experience with phones? Well, that's certainly a pretty high proportion. Some people, of course, most people have had the experience of calling someone who says, "Oh, that's funny, I was just thinking of you." What's going on? The skeptic will rapidly tell you that it's just chance coincidence. You think of people all the time for no reason. Most of the time they don't phone and you forget it. But when they do phone, you think it's telepathy and it's an illusion. That's the standard armchair argument, but there's not a shred of evidence to support that hypothesis. I've now been doing a series of experiments in which we have 4 potential callers. We've done a huge number of experiments now. In these experiments, if you were the subject, you'd name 4 people it might happen with. You sit at home on camera, being filmed continuously. We pick one of the 4 at random, tell them to ring you. You know the phone's going to ring at a particular time. You know it's going to be one of these 4 people. But before you pick it up, you have to guess who. I think it's John. Pick it up. Hi, John. Right or wrong? 25%, 1 in 4 chance of getting it right by chance. We've done 1,000 of these trials so far. The average success rate is 42%. This is hugely significant statistically. We've done some experiments were not filmed. We've done these trials are not filmed. The success rate in those trials, the chance expectations 25%. The actual success in those was 40%, probability 4 times 10 to the minus 16. In the filmed experiments, there's a higher success rate, 45%, probability 1 times 10 to the minus 12. These are massively significant effects. Most people score positively in these tests. They're immensely reproducible. We've looked into the Effects of distance. We've had callers from Australia and New Zealand to England. It works just as well. It's not distance dependent. With phones, you can do it over any distance you like up to the Antipodes. Also compared familiar and unfamiliar people. You'll recall the hypothesis is that telepathy works social. Where we've had half the callers familiar, the other half unfamiliar. With the familiar callers, the success rate's over 50%, massively significant. With the unfamiliar ones, it's at the chance level. This is interesting because much parapsychological research on telepathy, like those Rhine card-guessing experiments, has involved total strangers. And I think one of the reasons parapsychology hasn't advanced faster is that they've ignored the biological basis for this. They've worked with complete strangers, where you wouldn't expect an effect, and they often don't get one. So these telepathy experiments show amazingly repeatable results. We've got very similar results in email telepathy experiments. Email telepathy is the latest development, evolutionarily, of telepathy. You have 4 potential emailers. You know you'll get an email at, say, 9 o'clock. At 8:59, you send an email to me with your guess. So I got it stamped on the email what time it was sent, 8:59 and 13 seconds. At 9 o'clock, the person who's been picked at random emails you, and they send a CC to me. And so it's stamped on the email 9:00 and 25 seconds or whatever. So we know the guess is made before the email is sent. And again, with 25% is your expectation, 42% is the success rate in our unfilmed tests. P equals 1 times 10 to the minus 18. In the filmed experiments so far, we've only done 90 of them so far, P equals 0.001. These are massively significant. We have an online version of this under test at the moment, and it should be going online quite soon. This would then enable anyone to do telepathy experiments with their friends by email, free of charge. I'm hoping that will generate massive amounts of data, shock and awe levels of data, which I think should help to clear the logjam there's been on this field of research for so many years. If you can get reproducible results massively replicated, the argument's over. And I think we're within a very short distance of that actually happening. I may be absurdly over-optimistic. There may be flaws I haven't thought of. But I can assure you, most of the hard-hitting skeptics in the world have already had a long, careful look at these data and have failed to find flaws. Some have found minor faults, which we've now rectified. But basically, the phenomenon seems robust. I'm going to end by showing a film of one of these telephone telepathy experiments that was done recently in Britain for television. They wanted to see if they could do their own experiment for television. They didn't take my word for it. They wanted to reproduce it themselves. I offered some of my own subjects for this, and they didn't want those. They said, this is television. We want celebrities. So they recruited a 1980s pop group, a girl band of sisters, the Nolan sisters, and did it where 4 of them are in one in the studio. Actually, it was a bar in Soho. And the other one was in a hotel more than a mile away. And the test was to see whether one sister could tell when the others were calling. So you can actually see one of these experiments for yourself right now. Could we have the next video, please? This, again, I apologize to those watching the streaming thing. We cannot show this on the internet for copyright reasons. Yes, yes, there's a technical hitch. Well, incidentally, this telephone telepathy experiment is quite simple to do. All these things make great student projects. And the instructions are on my website if you want to run your own. And it is quite simple. Oh, no. Well, let me just go on a little bit. We'll come to that, I hope, in a moment. What I'm talking about really is a field theory of the mind. And if computers are ever to simulate minds, I don't think they're going to be able to do it by digital sort of standard type of technologies. I think there's going to have to be computers that work on a field principle. And the other thing is that morphic fields work, I believe, by influencing otherwise random events. They impose patterns on random events. Computers don't have randomness within them, and when they do have apparent randomness, it's usually pseudo-random number generators. So for a computer to be able to have a morphic field working in it, it would have to have real randomness. How are we getting on, technically? Well, it worked when we tested it a little while ago. Well, there you are.
Disruption in the videotape, so...
You mean the tape is broken, is it?
Well,
It worked when we...
it doesn't play, so...
The play indicates it's playing, but there's no signal coming out of it.
Really? Because it worked when we tested it.
It looked like it was playing, but it was on a blank perfect tape.
Well, how odd. Okay, well, look, let me finish off talking about we'll have the discussion in a moment. We may not be able to see the tape for obvious reasons. I think that if computers are to work, they'd have to have true randomness within them. And there was a very interesting thing happened a few years ago in Britain. There's a computer magazine called Computer Shopper. And I was just sitting at home innocently one day when the telephone started ringing, the BBC, television, CNN News, and so on. And they all said they'd read Computer Shopper magazine on this incredible breakthrough. And I said, well, what incredible breakthrough? Because I didn't know anything about it. And they said, and then I got, of course, rushed down to a shop and got a copy. And what it said was that there was a report that people had tried to look for morphic resonance in computers. They'd got a computer doing a genetic algorithm that converges on a solution over a certain number of trials. And they'd got the computer working on genuine randomness. There was a real randomizer, they said. And they repeated the trial over and over again. And the computer learned it faster and faster. There seemed to be a learning effect due to what they suggested was morphic resonance, this memory effect that I think is inherent in morphic fields. With a pseudo-random number generator, this didn't happen. Well, obviously, if this was true, this was a total breakthrough that would change the world as we know it, because if computers had morphic resonance, they could communicate worldwide without the need for satellites, wires, modems, airport cards, or anything. There'd be a collective memory and so forth. So I called up the magazine, and I said, I've got to speak to the people who wrote this article. And I got hold of the chap who'd written the article, and he said, well, he said, this is going haywire. We're getting calls at the office. The switchboards are jammed. And I said, well, look, please explain what's going on. He said, well, you know, I hate to have to say this, but take a look at the issue you've got in your hand. And I said, yes. He said, take a look at the date. I looked at the top, April the 1st. He said, it's our April Fool issue. He said, but it's worked far too well. And suddenly, all around the world, there were ripples of excitement of this whole new computer technology that was opening up. It turned out they'd thought up this idea. I met the guys who'd done it in a pub a few days later, and they'd thought it up on a rather drunken evening a bit before April the 1st. And they tried to think of something that could just be plausible. And this was what they came up with. It was very, very interesting. Someone in America, a programmer called Steve Rook, actually tried to do this experiment using a graphics program with real randomization. Unfortunately, he got sidetracked. His graphics program was generating computer art of such originality and staggering beauty that he went into the computer art business and forgot the morphic resonance experiment. So it's never been done. But I think that the computers that work quantum computing, where it is based on quantum non-locality, quantum effects, may well converge with some of these things I've been talking about. I think regular digital programmed computers with non-randomness within them, working according to kind of cognitive psychology type principles, there's not much chance of getting very far very fast. So I think that this does have implications if minds work in a very different way from the way they're usually assumed to, as I think they do. If they're field phenomena, the way we might model them and get artificial intelligence would be very different from many of the approaches that have been pursued so far. At any rate, I'd just like to end by saying that at the very least, these investigations show that there's a huge amount we still don't understand, and a vast amount more that we need to investigate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to continue with that discussion for till a quarter after the hour, and then we'll open up the floor to I'm sure there's a few questions in the house, and after that I think we'll try and see the video afterwards, because Murphy's law is such that Murphy was an optimist. So
we could probably move that if it's blocking people's views, because we won't need that anymore.
I'm going to do that right now. Technology from the last century.
But which works.
Which does work. And I'd like to continue with that with, I know you know Dick Bierman, who's a Global Consciousness Project. He's one of our lecturers in 2 weeks. And they're looking at the idea of random computers that are running random number generators all over the world, and then having global events like the thing at 9/11 actually affecting those machines, which to me implies, if the research is valid, and it's been going on at Princeton for 20 years now by groups of engineers, that machines could be affected by morphic fields. Is that something that you think is possible?
Oh, I think machines, and I think true randomness, I think can be affected by morphic fields. It's how morphic fields, I think, work. I find these Princeton global consciousness experiments a bit puzzling because they're so unbiological. There's no particular reason why people's thoughts about 9/11 should affect a random event generator that they don't even know is there. I mean, it's very amazing it works at all. I would never have predicted something like that, I must say. But in terms of the bigger question of can we influence random events through morphic fields, or do morphic fields, that's the entire hypothesis, and I think that would be something you'd expect. It's also the case, as I mentioned, that the vast majority of modern computers don't have real randomness anywhere in them. The last thing people want is real randomness in their computer. You press a button to do one thing and something else happens. But it does sometimes happen anyway. But nearly all computer randomization programs are pseudo-random number generators with no real randomness, only a simulation of it. The key thing there is they developed an electronic randomizer.
Yeah. And do you think then that if a computer or groups of computers could develop intelligence, artificial intelligence, that its morphic field could influence us? Would it be possible to work in the opposite ways, I wonder? Or is it the concept of someone that's conscious, something that's sentient creates the morphic field?
Morphic fields organize self-organizing systems, and insofar as one could create, if one could create a computer that had a field working in and through it, I suppose it could influence us. It would depend on bonding, but some people are pretty bonded to their computers, so it's not inconceivable. This is taking us into a realm of speculation I haven't even conceived of before. So, but it's, if pets can influence us, because this influencing pets telepathically can work the other way around too. Most people are much less sensitive than pets, so it works much less the other way. But quite a number of people are influenced by their pets. People with cats particularly. A lot of people have told me that the cat, if they don't have a cat flap, the cat has to have a door or window open to come in. Some people who own cats have found that for no apparent reason, they get up from whatever they're doing, go and open the door or window as if in a kind of hypnotic trance, and just to see the cat walking up the bottom of the garden towards the door. A bit like those infrared garage door openers. The cat's sort of getting people to do what it likes telepathically. So it can work the other way, and I suppose possibly, if people bonded with their intelligent computers, it could work from the computer to the person.
Well, I think it was interesting you brought up Alan Turning's experiment, and And I think that's an interesting model that he, one of the founders of this field of computational analysis, artificial intelligence, was someone who was thinking of this. Because, the things you research are considered outside the realm of science as such. And I think, the field of artificial intelligence is also outside the realm of science because it doesn't exist yet. I mean, there are many people who say it cannot exist, it will not exist. Many say it may. What are your feelings? Will you see this in your lifetime?
Well, I think if artificial intelligence research actually looked at field-like systems and real randomness, possibly, I think if it goes on with the sort of standard old-style artificial intelligence, very, very little chance at all. In fact, it's been enormously disappointing to many people in the field. I mean, the hype we were hearing 10, 20 years ago about artificial intelligence, most of it just simply hasn't come true. And so I think if there is an attempt to look at more field-like situations, this could happen. There was a fascinating report in today's New Scientist I read on the plane coming here from London about a new system of computation. They've got junctions that can't recognize, they can only recognize 0 or 1, and in some networks they wanted to have them being able to recognize symmetrical or asymmetrical situations. No normal way could do it. They set up what they called a liquid interface. They had a little bit of water here, and if it was a 1, this side would vibrate the water. If it was a 0, it wouldn't vibrate. If two sides were vibrating, you get patterns of ripples set up. If it's vibrated from one side or another, they're asymmetric. If it's vibrated from both sides at the same time or from neither at the same time, it's symmetric. And a little camera picks up these ripples. And the ripples integrate these effects. And when one looks at the surface of a pond and you throw stones in, every stone you throw in causes ripples which the pond automatically integrates in. It's a field system. Mm-hmm. And to have a field, a liquid surface, I've always thought would be a great way of creating a model of a field. And here's the very first time I've seen a liquid interface computer, liquid computing it's called. And they think it has a bright future. I was really excited by that.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, I think, when I read research by Marvin Minsky, one of the founders of the AI field, and his kinds of critiques on how it's not moving fast enough, it may be the minds of the researchers that's the problem. That they're not open to new ideas and looking at data in ways that allow them to make these kinds of breakthroughs.
Well, I think they're working within a paradigm, and people like Daniel Dennett, who's a fairly sophisticated philosopher, much influenced by artificial intelligence, he's an out-and-out materialist, and he's a very clever defender of the materialist point of view, but it does keep it within this very limited materialism. It's all in the brain. And this has behind it a whole agenda that goes back to the 18th century, rationalism and so on. Nothing wrong with being rational. In fact, I'm all in favor of it. What I'm against is when rationalism becomes a dogma and a limitation on the real use of reason and science. And I think for many people it has. And there's an ideological commitment, which is way beyond any kind of ordinary, lightly held scientific hypothesis. It's very deep-seated, and it's the same thing that gives rise to the kind of knee-jerk skepticism about telepathy and so on. Most people have this knee-jerk skepticism, know nothing whatever about the evidence, and they're in a model of total denial because it doesn't fit a particular worldview. I think that has been a terrible prison for much of institutional science, dealing both with psychology and with artificial intelligence.
Well, it's interesting. I'd like to open up the floor now to see if there's anyone with a question, and I see a very first one back there, and Fleur is going to most graciously be our...
Your mind. I mean, you gave us a lot of statistics, but I don't know, either in the Western world or on your travels in India, maybe you met some people that totally had 100% accuracy in knowing that someone was watching them, or is it always like 3 out of 5, or...
Well, yes. Some of the very first experiments I did on the sense of being stared at were with my own children. My own children are the sort of participants of first resort in my research. And they started young. I think the first staring experiment I did with them was when my older son was 4 years old. And when I explained to him, I said, you sit there, you're going to wear this blindfold I'm going to sit behind you, and sometimes I'm going to look at you, and sometimes I'm not. You have to say when I'm looking at you, when I'm not. He was 100% correct. It was astonishing. He said, "You're looking now, Daddy." He said, "No, you're not looking, Daddy." And then he was amazingly correct. It was astonishing how good he was at this. But then he said, "Can I do it with you?" I said, "Well, okay." He did it with me, and I was only just above chance. And then he learned that you can be wrong, and doubt set in. And he was never as good after that. He's still pretty good at it. He's above chance. But this 100% success was completely mind-blowing to me. And there was no possibility of this 4-year-old child cheating. He was under complete observation and so forth. And he wouldn't have thought of it. I treated it as a kind of game. So yes, there have been cases like that. And I think actually telepathy between parents and children is one of the commonest and most biological kinds. One of the things I've looked at and discuss in my book is mother-baby telepathy. Many mothers who are breastfeeding find that when they're away from their baby, their milk lets down, their nipples start leaking. It's a characteristic physiological response to the baby's needs. Usually happens when the baby cries. But they could be kilometers away from their baby. Most mothers, when this happens, either go home or phone home. And we've done a statistical study with 20 nursing mothers, which show that they're not always right, but they're right far more than chance. The odds against chance are 1 billion to 1. I mean, it's a hugely significant effect. I'm longing to get a filmed version of this, where with a split screen, on one side you see the baby waking up and crying. The other, the mother in a supermarket, for example, she'd have to not to wear breast pads for this, but you'd see damp patches spreading on her blouse. We haven't yet managed to do this on film.
We got another question. Rob?
I can imagine, and I was wondering, it could have an evolutionary benefit, of course, to develop such a thing instead of not having such a thing. A child who's almost drowning, shouting for his mother, which is half a kilometer away, but not seeing its child,
yes,
would have an immense benefit of survival. So you could imagine that if such a thing would exist,
yes,
that it would be evolutionarily developed already,
yes,
much more than it is now.
Well, this is a good point. The thing is that I think that these things do happen a lot. In my collections of case histories on human telepathy, a very large number are from mothers who say that they suddenly had an urge to go home and their child had had an accident, or even when the children are grown up. It happens most between mothers and daughters, because women are definitely better at these things than men, just as most people assume. That quite often, a woman will tell me, "Oh, well, I suddenly felt I got to phone my daughter and I found she was really depressed. She just had a row with her husband." She still needs to phone. Yes, but the thing is that in traditional societies, unfortunately, our anthropologists have failed us terribly, because when they went and studied traditional societies, they went with the rationalist mindset and dismissed all this stuff as mumbo-jumbo. But travelers in Africa and Asia, and my own experiences in India, have shown these things are taken for granted far more there than they are here. Almost everyone who's lived in Africa is astonished at the way they know when people are going to arrive, they know when they're needed. Someone will suddenly say, "Oh, I've got to go because my mother needs me," or the child's sick. It does happen a great deal in traditional societies. In our society, I don't think it's that humans have lost this kind of thing. I think modern Western people have lost it. Not even in the West, despite every discouragement, it still goes on to an amazing degree. But I think that it's simply discouraged by our official system. A lot of people are told, "Don't be silly." Most people, if they have telepathic experiences, prefer not to talk about them because they know that educated people are not meant to believe in it. And children are not encouraged to develop these. They're discouraged quite often. I think that looking at, it's a much fairer test of your point to look at pre-technological societies where these things are taken for granted and do actually play a part in the way they lead their lives. They're taken for granted. So I think that the evolutionary benefits are probably real. And I think that I have in my book a chapter on the evolution of telepathy. I think this is a whole field yet to be explored, but I think if it happens, it certainly has a selective advantage if it happens at all. And I think it may happen very widely in the animal kingdom. If I had the chance, I'd investigate these things in non-Western societies, because I'm sure we'd find they're much more common.
When does Western society start?
Well, I think I'd look at, for example, in Africa and India, among the non-urbanized middle class, the people in villages. And in the West, I think less educated people are generally better at this than more educated people. And children are generally better than adults. So I think I'd look at children, relations between mothers and children, parents and children. Works with fathers too. Most of my own telepathic experiences have been with my children. In fact, I had one with about Alan Turing. I was in a taxi with my two sons in London. We were going to Paddington Station. They were playing in the back of the taxi. And we passed a house with a blue plaque, and it said, Alan Turing lived here. And I thought, well, shall I comment on it? I'd never noticed it before. And so I thought, well, there's no point in mentioning it, because they'd only say, who was Alan Turing, Daddy? And about a minute later, my older son said, Daddy, what's the name of the man who cracked the Enigma code during the war and who invented computers? And I said, why, Alan Turing? Why did you ask? He said, oh, well, some boys were talking about it at school. They'd seen a television program a few days ago. I just suddenly thought of it. So I think that actually those are the places to look.
Another question here? And then over here.
I just have a very technical question, just because I don't understand. When you say real randomness is sort of the place to look in computers for, I don't understand what the difference is, because, well, every computer can create random numbers, and that is random in my idea, but I'm not a computer.
No, they can't, actually can't. A program is inherently cannot duplicate random.
There's a program that generates a random sequence. It may be the decimal points of pi, or it may be generated by an equation. But if you start the equation at the same place, it'll give the same sequence every time. It's a totally predictable sequence that looks random. The difference between that and a real random event like quantum noise or really random things like quantum randomness is that however many, if you repeat the real randomness, you'll never get the same thing twice. These things, you start the program, you press the button, it'll come out with exactly the same sequence over and over and over again. It's programmed to produce a pseudo-random sequence.
In the program, it may be random, may have randomness in it over a period of time, but over the long run, it will repeat itself. So, anyways, and we got a question over here.
Do you think that speech is counterproductive for telepathy, or can it coexist, as you thought that telepathy is originated from the animal kingdom?
Well, I think that speech and telepathy coexist, and I think that, in fact, my view is that telepathy is probably going on all the time, even when we're using language, because I wouldn't expect it simply to stop existing when you start speaking. And in fact, as you saw with the parrot experiment, you often get telepathy to do with speech. A lot of married couples have the experience that one of them will say something and the other says, oh, I was just thinking that. So it can express itself in words and in language. So I don't think it's speech that inhibits telepathy, and I think it works with it. I think that particularly when it's to do with the communication of visual images, many people have told me that they can be trying to describe a film to somebody, and if they do it in words, the other person doesn't get it. If they think the pictures while they're describing it, they say the other person suddenly gets it, what they're trying to talk about. So I think the communication of quite a lot of information, even in ordinary communication, may involve a telepathic component. So I think it can work along with speech. Of course, it would be hard to prove that. But one of the things that's particularly interesting here is communicating mathematical ideas. Roger Penrose, who's a famous Oxford mathematician, who's worked quite a lot on the question of artificial intelligence and its possibility, comments in his book, The Emperor's New Mind, that he's always been amazed at how he can get a new mathematical idea no one's had before and can communicate it to someone else just by a few marks with chalk on a blackboard. He said, you're certainly not getting the visual image of the idea. You're not really getting the full experience of the idea from a few marks of chalk. But suddenly someone will get it. Now, he doesn't explain it as telepathy, which I would think. He says he's a Platonist, like many mathematicians. He thinks that he's tuned into an ideal, eternal mathematical thought form in the mind of God, or in somehow beyond space and time. And the other person suddenly gets it and tunes into this Platonic idea. Most people would find that very weird. Most mathematicians like that, though, because they are Platonists, generally speaking. But I think a much simpler explanation is that it's telepathic. And so I think mathematical telepathy is actually rather a good area to look for this.
I think we're running it short here. I think this will be one of the last questions. I'd like to hear from you.
Yes, as a cat could control its owner, now if a person would catch on to the techniques of the morphing fields, and get in there, then in theory that person would be able to control a whole city or even a larger area.
Well, the thing about morphic fields of social groups is that the people, for telepathy to work, it usually depends on people being bonded. Now, there is a certain level of bonding, I suppose, in an entire society. Charismatic political leaders, whether they're good or bad influences on the society, are ones who somehow seem to tap into the field of the whole group and do influence the way the thinking goes. And this is one of the features of a charismatic leader, this ability to influence, as it were, the whole social field. So I think that probably does involve a kind of field phenomenon. And of course, it can be used for good or for ill. And if the advertising industry found out how to do it more effectively, I'm sure they would. But I think these things are going on all the time anyway. It's not as if there's a new principle here. It's simply bringing to consciousness something which I think is happening anyway.
And I think we have a last question back here.
Okay. I want to know, why do people feel nervous when they show up on the camera, first of all? And is it because they know that they're being stared at?
Well, I think the bigger question is, why do some people feel nervous about standing up in front of other people and making a public speech, for example? Some people are completely terrified of saying anything in public. I think it may be something to do with the focusing of attention on them. And of course, it's not just cameras. The same happens with any speech. It happens with actors in plays. And actors in plays in a theatre, are very much influenced by the atmosphere and the quality of attention that's coming to them. So I think these are things of common experience, that when many people's attention is focused on you, you are linked in a kind of field. So for some people, it produces this kind of panic response. I don't know quite why. I've never actually studied that point, but it's certainly related to everything we've been talking about. And there is a kind of field effect of collected attention when a lot of people are concentrating on the same thing, as in a lecture like this, or in a theatre, or in television.
Now we're coming to the end of the streaming part of the program, and in a few minutes we'll cut the link to the internet. But I think there's more questions. People can stay around and ask her more questions. And we're going to try and reverse Murphy's Law and get the videotape working. And we're also going to do a staring experiment. So there's lots more happening. I think we should all thank for our online audience, Mr. Sheldrake, for his most amazing...
Let's have a few more questions. Okay, well, I'm going to fall.
Wires.
Thank you. I wonder if you have any theory what could be the physical basis of the telepathy and within a morphic field. Are we talking particles? Are we talking waves? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I wish I knew. I think that morphic fields, are closer to quantum fields than to any other kind we know in physics. And I think these telepathic phenomena, which are not distance dependent. It's not only in my own research, but all research and all the anecdotal evidence also shows a non-distance dependence in telepathy. I think the closest analogy is quantum non-locality. And in quantum non-locality, when one particle, you know, in the classic experiment where you have two photons leaving an atom going in opposite directions, you measure the polarization of one, and instantaneously the other one takes up the opposite polarization. Now, the influence that goes from one to the other is not in that mediated by particles there. Particles could not travel faster than the speed of light, and yet these particles are moving away at the speed of light. They're photons, so it's twice the speed of light. The influence is moving. So it's not particles. It's a kind of field effect which is described in quantum field theory in some higher dimensional space. Quantum field theory has lots of extra dimensions, and you know, exactly how we conceive of these is another question. In fact, you can't really conceive of them. But the field equations of quantum theory allow for this kind of thing, even though there's nothing actually moving in between them. So that's the kind of physics which provides the best analogies. I don't think this is at all like electromagnetic radiation, where you have, you know, radiating light from a point source having an inverse square law effect, or gravity. This is a different phenomenon, and that's the best analogy. And I wish I knew more. There are several quantum physicists very interested in this phenomenon, but most quantum theorists don't spend any time thinking about telepathy, because they're obviously not going to get grants for doing that, and they'd have to do it in secret anyway. But if there's a massive amount of evidence for telepathy, if we have what's an agreed and established fact, and I think we could be in that situation soon, then I think there'll be a lot more people think that it's worth turning their attention to thinking about the theoretical basis. I'm not a physicist. I don't know enough maths to do that myself. There are plenty of physicists who could look at this kind of thing. One of the ones who's doing so is Brian Josephson, who got the Nobel Prize for his inventing the Josephson junction. He spends most of his time now thinking about telepathy and quantum physics. He's a professor at Cambridge. So there are a few people already thinking about this.
I know you are familiar with the phenomenon of family constellations of Bert Hellinger.
Yes.
Where a group of people have information about a field of a family of somebody who they don't know at all. Can you say something about that, what you think that's happening there?
Well, does everyone here know about Bert Hellinger?
Not really.
No. Oh, well, I'll have to explain something about Hellinger for it to make sense to anyone else then. Briefly, there's a German psychotherapist called Bert Hellinger who's developed a system called systemic family therapy, which is a very remarkable system, which is enormously popular and influential in Germany, and is not so well known in the English-speaking world. How it works is that, say you have some problem in your family, you'd be sitting by him, and he'd then say, okay, set up your family constellation. You pick someone to represent your father, your mother, your brothers, your sisters, and then you arrange them. So you might put the father looking like this, and you might put one of the sisters next to him, and then the mother might be over there looking into the distance with her back to the father. You arrange them as you think the family could be represented, and it's like a static tableau. This is a little bit like some Gestalt therapy of family techniques. But what happens is that it, as it were, models the family field. And he thinks of it as a kind of field phenomenon. Sometimes the people who are standing in for people in the family, he can ask them, how do you feel? And people pick up emotions which correspond remarkably to those of the person in that position in the family. He thinks of it as a field phenomenon. I think the family is a field. The field, it's a social group with a morphic field. Morphic fields, according to my hypothesis, have a kind of built-in memory through morphic resonance. And Hellinger's system often finds that disturbances in the present family are related to past generations, where there were disturbances in the family field. There's a sort of unconscious family patterns that influence people now, without them realizing why. One of the things that causes particularly big problems is when people have committed suicide, or when children have died young and haven't been acknowledged, and they've sort of blotted out of people's memories. These missing members of the family create great disturbances in the field, and when he discovers such a thing, he finds a person, he picks someone to stand in and replaces the missing person. It has a healing effect on the field. He claims that quite often the person who's undergoing this therapy can have an extraordinary sense of liberation and healing. And quite often when they get home, members of the family they haven't spoken to for years call up and say, "What's happened? I feel something's really changed in our family." There's a kind of telepathic effect on the rest of the family. These are claims that Hellinger and his followers often make. I've been trying to persuade some of his associates, particularly Hunter Beaumont, who works in Germany, to do proper research on this, to document these cases. And Hunter's actually interested in doing that. I think it's a fascinating way of looking at this. Normally, of course, like most psychotherapists, they just do their thing and then they go on to the next patient. They're not so interested in research or documenting these things. But I think it would be fascinating if they do.
Okay, we got another question here.
Yeah. Well, actually, okay. The zero distance is a very interesting point because it has great implications that no matter what you're looking at or thinking, you are it. You are in conjunction with it. So looking out into space and would make everything just not there, but just wherever your eyes or ears or any of your senses are. So this implication could manifest in such a way, it seems to me, that it's almost like folding space, in a sense, or the superstring theory that makes, everything out there almost intelligible or unintelligible. We can work with that here because we all have it.
Well, I think there's a difference between the sense of being stared at, which has a distance dependence because it's dependent on light. And, someone can tell if you're staring at them when they're a few meters away. If they're a mile away and you can't see them, obviously it's not going to work. So there is a distance dependence in that phenomenon. However, I think as long as you can see the object that's far away, I think if you look at a distant star, your mind in a sense touches it. And I think our minds can literally reach out into the heavens and connect us with the stars. Of course, it would be hard to test that. So I think the sense of being stared at has a distance dependence because it depends on light, which has a distance dependence. When it comes to telepathy and you have these bonds, then that's where you don't get this distance dependence, as long as the bond is there. I think if you're talking to someone you don't know, you've only just met, there could be a telepathic communication while you're interacting, but as soon as you're apart, there isn't a kind of ongoing bond unless they've had a huge effect on you. Normally these bonds take time to build up. They contain a kind of memory of the past interactions. So then once the bond is there, then you'd have this non-local effect. That is very like non-locality in quantum theory. It has to be the same system before you get non-locality. It's not any old electron or photon that will influence any other. They've got to have been part of the same interacting system. So, yes, I think it does lead to a very different sense of these, but in a sense we already know these things because when people are very close to someone, even if they're in Australia or the other side of the world, they still feel that bond. People carry around photos of their loved ones. They think about them, they pray for them, and so on, however far away they are. We already know that social bonds aren't broken simply by distance if they're strong social bonds. Yes, I think you could call this, all these things you could call the sixth sense, or actually in Germany they call them the seventh sense, which is the term I prefer. Because some biologists have claimed that the electromagnetic sense is the sixth sense. Some birds can detect magnetic fields, some fish can detect electric fields. So they say, okay, here's the sixth sense, it's electromagnetic field sense. That's fine by me. So, okay, to avoid confusion, let's call all this the seventh sense. This new book of mine in German is called Der siebte Sinn des Menschen, the seventh sense of people. And so I quite like the seventh sense. I prefer that terminology to saying it's extrasensory perception, which just simply means it's beyond the senses, makes it mysterious. Or saying it's psychic, which is okay, but it leaves unanswered the question of how the psyche works.
I think we're going to take one last question. We're going to have a break, and then we're going to come back for hopefully more questions, video, and experiments, if that's all right with everyone involved.
It's fine with me.
But, okay, maybe two. You're really insistent. Okay, 2 questions. And then